my name is Alan Journet. I am co-founder and co-facilitator of Southern Oregon Climate Action Now. I'd like to welcome you to a focus on climate action. My charge today is to talk to you about what we can do individually and collectively to address climate change. But before I go there, I would like to present to you what the problem is and what's causing the problem, just so we understand the issues. Anybody who's spent a bit of time in Southern Oregon, particularly over the last couple of months, will be aware that towards the end of July we experienced an extensive period of days with the temperature above 100 degrees, which was a little stunning for most of us. But let's put that into context. If we look at the pattern in Medford, now taking us back to the beginning of the last century, what we find is the number of days over 100 degrees has actually increased from something like 6 or 7 days up to about 12 days. We can see that there have been a number of years during that period when there have been actually no days over 100 degrees, and we can also see, particularly during more recent decades, there have been years with 20 or more days over 100 degrees. But that pattern of 6 or more days consecutively over 100 degrees was a little stunning. What we have seen over the last century, and I'm using Medford just as an example to illustrate the problem in Southern Oregon, is that the number of days over 100 degrees has been increasing by 1 about every 2 decades. Let's now look at the temperature history and trends through the end of this century for Jackson County, again as an example. If we look at the upper graph, which is the annual average temperature, what we can see is 2 lines. The first line is a red line, which gives us the history 1950 to about 2010. But that red line, which moves forward, is called the business as usual greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, and that's because this is the trajectory that we are on. The blue line, which you can see is a little lower than that, represents a situation where we're a little smarter. The business as usual trajectory assumes that we continue the current practice of ever accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. The blue trajectory assumes that we reduce that trajectory and don't move on such an alarming trajectory of emissions increases. You can see that by the end of the century, according to the business as usual scenario, we're likely to be up around 59 degrees Fahrenheit for the average annual temperature. Again, if we're a little smarter and we follow the blue trajectory, the temperature increase is not quite so remarkable. Let's come down to the lower graph now and look at the increase over the 1950 to 2010 average. And again, what we see is the business as usual, or red line, shows us increasing in Jackson County by as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. Again, if we are a little smarter and follow the blue trajectory, we are only going to increase by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's hope we can keep it to the lower trajectory. If we look now at the pattern across Southern Oregon from the coast, Curry County, to the eastern edge of Oregon, Malheur County, what we see by the end of the century, according to the business as usual scenario, again, is that the coast will likely see a temperature increase of approaching 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and Malheur County at a temperature increase approaching 11 degrees Fahrenheit. That trend is because the coastal climate is much more moderated by the maritime climate of the coast. As we go inland, things get more dry and changes are more dramatic. Let's now look at precipitation, again for Jackson County as the example. The annual average precipitation, as you can see in the top chart here, is pretty flat. The history is pretty flat, variable but flat, meaning not much change over that period of time, if any. And as we go into the future, again we can see the red line, remember the business as usual trajectory, and the blue assuming that we modify our behavior somewhat. What you can see is, as we go through the century, the line overall is pretty flat, meaning we're not going to see much, if anything, on average of a change of precipitation. We do see, however, a trend in which the peaks are higher and the troughs are lower. And what that simply means is the wet years are going to be wetter and the dry years likely drier. If we look now at the average winter change in precipitation, this is winter now, not the annual average, just winter. What we're seeing is maybe a slight increase in precipitation as we go through the century. For summer, what we're likely to see is a decrease in precipitation. And when I introduce this idea to folks, they often say, well, goodness gracious, it doesn't rain very much in Southern Oregon anyway. Well, yeah, that's right, during the summer. But as we go through the century, that amount of precipitation is likely to drop. Let's now look at snow. Skiers are particularly concerned about the amount of snow that falls, but from an ecological perspective, what's important is not the total amount of snow, not the thickness of snow, but the snow water equivalent, meaning the amount of water that's in that snow. What we can see is a trend which has been happening since about the 1970s of decreasing snow water equivalent in Jackson County. And again, as we go through the century, what we're likely to be seeing, again following the business as usual future trajectory, what we're likely to be seeing is a drop in snow water equivalent, meaning a drop in snowfall, which approaches zero by the end of the century. So by the end of the century, we're likely to have no snowfall in Jackson County, maybe at the higher elevations, but down in the valley probably pretty close to zero. The blue line suggests we might get a little more. If we go up to Crater Lake, we can see the trend since the 1930s. I think that was pretty much since Crater Lake was invented. We can see a trend of decreasing snowfall in Crater Lake. A lot of variability, clearly, but overall the trend in Crater Lake is one of a dropping amount of snowfall. This is critical because for us in the west, particularly in the Rogue Valley, Applegate Valley, what we have been doing is using snowfall as our reservoir to provide water during spring, summer, and fall as that snow melts. If there's less snowfall up at the high elevations, there's going to be less water for our consumption and irrigation. And that's illustrated here. The consequences that we are likely to see from the patterns that I've just described, that's increasing temperatures, decreasing precipitation during the summer, and decreasing snowpack, are reduced water availability for consumption and irrigation. The consequence from an ecological perspective is going to be drying soils, drying vegetation, and substantially increased fire risk. We live in a part of the country which already suffers from a Mediterranean climate, which is a summer dry, winter wet climate. So historically our summers have always dried out, and that means we have had a fire risk here for eons. This fire risk is going to be increasing as we go through the century unless we address the climate change problem. Let's now explore what is causing that problem, and it's the basic greenhouse or thermal blanket effect. So what you can see here is the Earth in green and an atmosphere which contains a number of gases, particularly greenhouse gases. And this is the process that's happening. Incoming radiation from the sun, particularly in the light wavelengths, reaches the surface of the Earth, and when it reaches the surface of the Earth, it is transformed into infrared radiation, longer wavelength radiation, that is heat. And that heat starts radiating back outwards through our atmosphere. Because of the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, that thermal blanket, some of that infrared radiation is absorbed as heat and bounces back and keeps us warm. The rest of it passes through the atmosphere and escapes into space. That's the basic pattern which we have experienced for millions of years. We are grateful to it because this is the pattern that allows the temperature on Earth to be at such a level, about 58, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which has allowed evolution to take place and has allowed the diversity of life that we currently enjoy to evolve. But what happens if we accentuate that greenhouse gas or thermal blanket effect by increasing the atmospheric greenhouse gases, the concentration? What we see is more of that outwardly radiating infrared heat is absorbed by those gases, and in turn less of that heat escapes into space. The consequence is warming of our atmosphere. That's what global warming is, an accentuation of that natural phenomenon of the greenhouse effect or the thermal blanket effect. An interesting question to ask is, what's happening to the heat that is being retained on the planet? If we look at this chart, what we will see is about 2.3% of that heat is actually retained in the atmosphere. That's not very much. And as we look at decreasing amounts, we see almost the same amount is retained in the land masses that are our continents. And as we look at respectively glaciers and ice caps, Arctic sea ice, Greenland ice, and Antarctic ice, we see progressively less and less of that heat is retained. Which begs the question, where is that heat going? And the answer is, it's warming our oceans. About 93.5% of the heat that's retained on the planet is actually warming our oceans. Again, we are grateful to our oceans for doing that, because if they weren't retaining that much heat, our atmosphere would be about 65 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and instead of hovering around 60 degrees Fahrenheit on average, our atmosphere would be about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, which you can imagine would be pretty toasty. So let's ask the question and answer the question, what are the main greenhouse gases in our atmosphere? The first one, with which most people are familiar, is carbon dioxide. This has a longevity in our atmosphere of centuries. And you can see illustrated there is the 100-year GWP, or global warming potential, of carbon dioxide. The global warming potential is a measure of the relative heating capacity of 1 kilogram of a gas compared to 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, as you will see, is set at the index value of 1. All the other gases that we will see in a moment are compared to that gas. This value, the global warming potential, is also known as the carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. The second most important greenhouse gas is methane. This has a 100-year global warming potential of 34. This is because it lasts in the atmosphere only a decade or so. It is more powerful, and we give it, for that reason, also a 20-year global warming potential, and that is 86. So on a 20-year basis, methane is 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at warming our atmosphere. Nitrous oxide has a longevity of about a century in the atmosphere, and that is 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in warming our atmosphere. Fortunately, methane and nitrous oxide are present in relatively low concentrations. We only measure those in parts per billion, whereas carbon dioxide is measured in parts per million, an M as opposed to a B. Water, otherwise known as dihydrogen monoxide, but hardly anybody uses that term, has a longevity in the atmosphere of about 10 days. This is a warming gas, water vapor, but because it only lasts such a short period of time, it doesn't have so much of a contributory effect. It's more of a consequence of warming. The warming atmosphere causes increased evaporation, and so the humidity of the atmosphere is indeed picking up, and that is exaggerating the warming effect that we have been seeing. The last gas set that I'll mention are the chlorofluorocarbons or hydrochlorofluorocarbons. These are human-made gases in the atmosphere. They have a 100-year global warming potential, many of them of over 5,000 times that of carbon dioxide. Fortunately, we haven't managed to release many of these into the atmosphere. They do have a considerable longevity of over a couple of centuries, as you can see. The major greenhouse gas emissions in the United States are coming from our burning of fossil fuels. Coal, for example, results in the release of carbon dioxide. Burning oil and gasoline results again in the release of carbon dioxide, and natural gas results in the release of both methane, that really powerful gas, and carbon dioxide. The methane is released largely as a function of the fracking of the gas, where considerable amount of the methane leaks, and also the processing and transmission of that gas through pipelines. In addition, our land management results in the emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly our transition of forests to agricultural land, which results in carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. Also, our agriculture and forestry practices result in the emissions of these gases. Let's look at the gases that are emitted by the United States, and now we're looking at EPA data from 2020, and again you can see carbon dioxide prominently displayed, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and the fluorinated gases down at 3%. What is it that we do that results in the emission of these gases? It's a very good question. What we can see here is the major activity in which we engage that results in the emission of those gases is transportation. That's the burning of fossil fuels in our transportation system. Our generation of electricity, to a large extent from coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants, results in 20%, 25% of the emissions. Our industrial activities are almost up there, and then our commercial and residential buildings also result in about 13% of greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see agriculture also contributes substantially. Back here in the Rogue Valley, a study was conducted a few years ago, and probably the data haven't changed since then, on greenhouse gas sources from what we do down here. The first thing that we do, which results in substantial greenhouse gas emissions, is we buy stuff, materials, our consumption of stuff like TVs and radios. If we, for example, buy a TV that's made in China, the emissions that result from the manufacture of that television and the transport of that television to us are charged against us. The second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions for us in the Rogue Valley is our local transportation and our public transit and our local freight, our private cars and trucks. These result in emissions of greenhouse gases to a large extent, and the last one is, again, our production of energy. Our use of energy doesn't result in emissions, but the production of the energy that we use does. And the fossil fuels that are used in the production of that energy release greenhouse gases. Let's now start looking at what it is we do and might do to correct the problem. Back when I was young, we focused pretty much solely on money. If money in was greater than money out, everybody was happy. The point now is we've got to start considering other things in our daily living. We have to start undertaking energy accounting, looking at the sources of energy that we use and what are the greenhouse gas emissions that result from the production of those energy sources. I have hope. Several years ago, back in 1995, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia and given absent treatment 2 months to live. I made it, and the reason that I made it was because I went through the treatment, and that's what we have to do as residents of this planet now. We have the technology to address the problem of global warming and climate change. We can reduce our personal emissions wherever possible. And what we have just talked about give us some clues as to the main things that we can look at to reduce our emissions. However, although the cumulative impact of millions of painless choices can be immense, the reality is individual action is not enough. We have to do more. And so I'm going to talk a little about individual action and collective action. The individual actions that I'll talk about are listed here, and then we'll get to the collective action towards the end. The first thing that we can do, which is incredibly important, is find out what it is that we do that results in greenhouse gas emissions. And we can do that by using a greenhouse gas footprint calculator. The one that we use with Southern Oregon Climate Action now is the Cool Climate greenhouse gas calculator, which comes from the University of California in Berkeley. What we do here is input our data on our daily activities and energy use. This encompasses our travel, our home use, our food, our goods and services, which combine to account for consumption. The program then compares our household emissions with others in our zip code with a comparable amount of family members and income, and then the program offers suggestions on ways to reduce our emissions. Let's look at transportation very quickly. The first thing we should be trying to do whenever possible is reduce our personal travel. We should drive economically, and that means pretty much at or below the speed limit, because slower driving generally results in less gas consumption. We can consolidate our trips, we can carpool, we can walk, bike, skateboard, and we can use public transit. We should also try to avoid airline flights. Every time we step on an aircraft, we are responsible for a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And if we have the capacity, we can buy an electric vehicle, whether it's a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, or a battery-driven electric vehicle. These vehicles do indeed save us both money and greenhouse gas emissions, indeed over the full life cycle of the vehicle. At home, the largest user of energy and producer of greenhouse gases is our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. We can adjust our thermostat up in the summer and down in the winter. We should avoid using natural gas in our homes, because that not only results in tremendous greenhouse gas emissions, but is also a vast health hazard. Folks with asthma suffer tremendously from the methane that's released as a result of natural gas use. We can install heat pumps or mini splits in our home, which are incredibly efficient at promoting warming and cooling. And we can heat, for example, heat or cool only those rooms which we occupy, not the whole house. We can moderate the pattern of heating our water such that we only heat the water that we need when we need it, rather than having the water heater on all day. We can weatherize to reduce heat loss in winter and heat gain in summer. And we should check the energy efficiency of our small appliances, and particularly if we're buying a new major appliance, we should look for the Energy Star rating, which gives us a measure of what the energy efficiency of those products is and what the greenhouse gas emissions are. We can also look at our overall lifestyle. One of the things that we very often don't think about is our investments, our banks. There are a number of banks which are incredibly committed to fossil fuel extraction and production with their investments. We really should try to avoid investing in those banks with our bank accounts and our mortgages. We should look for B corporations or Global Alliance for Banking Values Banks, or even credit unions, which tend not to invest in fossil fuels. As you have seen, transportation is a big contributor to the problem. We can buy locally grown produce and locally manufactured goods. For further tips, I'm going to encourage you to visit socan.eco/general and look for the list of local tips or tips that we offer for folks to reduce their emissions. One of the things that we should be doing is learning more about the climate crisis. SOCAN offers a Master Climate Protector annually where you can learn much more about the problem and what we can do to address it. We encourage folks to be a role model for friends and family and talk about the climate crisis and its solutions whenever possible. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communication has studied public opinion in the United States and has concluded that we fall into one of 6 categories: the alarmed, the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive. And what you can see here is the vast majority of us fit into one of the categories on the left, the categories of folks who are accepting of climate science and concerned about the problem. Although we tend to hear a lot about and from the folks who are more skeptical, notice that they are a very small percentage of the population. And this is from the nation as a whole. Let's now look a little closer to home at Oregon. The same Yale program has produced these opinion maps, and this reflects opinion in Oregon. What you can see here is the opinion in Oregon regarding the question, do you think global warming is happening? And many folks might be surprised to learn that in Oregon, every county has a population in which over 50% of the people accept that global warming is happening. If we look now at a slightly different question, do you think global warming is human-caused? We still find a lot of Oregonians accept that scientific conclusion, but we do find a number of counties, as you can see in the blue, in which the percentage of folks who accept human-caused global warming is much lower. Let's look now at some collective action. What we should be doing if we consider the climate crisis to be a serious problem, and in my judgment it seriously is, we should support and promote local, regional, state, and national proposals that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or promote greenhouse gas, particularly carbon sequestration, in our natural and working lands. And we should support and promote local, regional, state, and national candidates who accept climate science and commit to proposals that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and or promote, again, sequestration of greenhouse gases in our natural and working lands. Probably if there is one thing that we can do, this is an election year, it is look at candidates and ask if they accept the science on climate change and are committed to doing something. At the federal level, you might have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has recently been proposed. Though it's not as extensive and complete as we would have liked, it does allocate substantial funding to an array of actions which will contribute to reducing the climate crisis. Indeed, this Inflation Reduction Act has been calculated to produce about 10 million jobs over the next 10 years. So it's going to be very valuable to us in many respects. In Oregon, there is a governor's race coming up. During the 2020 Oregon legislative session, some of you might remember, a comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions reduction proposal was thwarted because Republicans walked out of both chambers. In March 2020, Governor Kate Brown issued an executive order which charged state agencies to undertake and develop programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within their authority, and now many of the state agencies have programs in place. According to the Oregon Public Broadcasting report of the recent debate among governors, 2 of those candidates, Drazen and Johnson, committed to rescinding the executive order which has done so much to reduce emissions in Oregon. Meanwhile, Tina Kotek, a former House Speaker, who repeatedly pushed regulations while she was in the legislature, has committed to building on what has already been done. Those concerned about climate can draw their own conclusions regarding candidates for governor. It's important to evaluate, as I mentioned, all candidates on the basis of their climate consciousness and their commitment to action. To help folks in this arena, SOCAN has arranged a couple of candidate forums on climate and environment, which will be held at the Medford Public Library from 7 to 9:30. All candidates for the respective offices have been invited. The Jackson County Commission and Congressional District 2 Forum will be on October the 4th. The State Legislative District Forum will be on October the 18th. We will be following Oregon Health Authority COVID protocols, and I encourage you to go to socan.eco/events and look at what those are in effect at the time. The big thing is to get involved with local, regional, state, and national climate organizations. Southern Oregon Climate Action Now has been here for 10 years. We're just coming up to our 10th anniversary in September. If you are interested in getting involved, please visit us at socan.eco. Thank you very much for paying attention, and that's my contribution to a focus on climate actions. This is Alan Journet wishing you good day.